Welcome everyone to the Modern Endpoint Management Summit of 2022. Kicking it off this morning with myself with a presentation here. So my name is Dujon Walsham. I'm currently a Microsoft MVP for the enterprise mobility category. Also currently endpoint manager architect. And this presentation, we will be going through the strategies and challenges around Autopilot and whether we want to go down the route of having pre-provisioning or not. So we will be exploring that a lot more in further detail. So next one, we'll be going through the agenda. So this is pretty much how the presentation is going to be structured. So first we'll talk about the breakdown of pre-provisioning so we can understand exactly the overall perception of how we see pre-provisioning and how that works. Next will be the effects on decision making with pre-provisioning and how we come to the conclusions of choosing which way to go. Next, we'll also look at the Autopilot profile purpose. So we'll have a look at the actual purposes for each actual fit and analyze which one is a perfect fit depending on the requirements we have. And then next will be the separation from task sequence practices, so we can sort of analyze the transition from a typical SCCM type of methodology of deployment and then transitioning into Intune. The next one will be around the experiences. So we'll look at the technical user experience side of things, and then we'll also look at the user experience side of things as well. Then the next part will be the external perspective. So we'll have a look at how areas of bringing in hybrid into the picture and how third-party options can also have a say in the matter of which route we go as well. And then we'll close off with the overall summary just to give a quick overview of everything discussed. So with that being said, let's kick it off with the very first one. So we'll go through the background of the actual presentation just so we get more of a familiarity on sort of how this came about. So this presentation is inspired from a series which I've done, which is called Microsoft Endpoint Manager Autopilot White Glove or Not series. This is about 6-part series, which was available on the Windows Management Expert website, which gave great detail as to how to deal with making a decision of going to actual autopilot or not. So that's definitely a good series to actually check out. And then the strategies over time. So this is something that I had come up with over multiple different type of bespoke requirements for different clients over the years, especially when it comes to autopiloting and how they want these sort of user experiences to be, and also the sort of different kind of challenges as well. Not every organizational client's going to have the same kind of user experience in mind and how they want to sort of onboard users into an organization. So this is a good way to sort of group everything together and share those experiences. Challenge simplicity. And that wasn't actually me thinking. That's exactly how I would group this section here for challenge simplicity, because I think when it comes to Intune and Endpoint Manager overall, sometimes I think we can get caught up in how sort of simple it may look to actually configure certain options or configure anything in Intune, but to actually structure everything together so that the workflow really fits the actual requirements that we require, that's where the actual challenges come into play. So this is where we hope to sort of drill more down into the whole nitty-gritty part of how we actually make our choices in how we go in terms of autopilot, or we go with a white glove option. So that pretty much gives a background. So now we're going to go right into it now with the breakdown of pre-provisioning. So, okay, so how do we actually see pre-provisioning? What is pre-provisioning? So essentially, pre-provisioning or white glove is basically the method of preparing a device which essentially can apply to really any user. So you could very sort of compare it to sort of like an SCCM sort of fat client kind of build, where you have pretty much every single thing that you would need on there for a particular user to have. So everything from configurations, and especially when it comes down to the application side of things. But we will get more into sort of how we sort of separate that away from becoming too much of an actual task sequence. So, and the other part is the administrative effort cut down as well. So a lot of people perceive the white glove option as a way of cutting down the actual effort of actually providing maybe a user a device, and then having to sort of jump in and sort of have to sort out certain technical issues, and having the user to actually have to wait through the autopilot profile deployment period. So this is a way that that's been analyzed to sort of take away those parts. And then just on the side, we've just got two specific graphics which pretty much sort of give an idea on how the actual workflow goes in terms of the autopilot side. So the top one here is more around how we add devices into the autopilot portal, and then the autopilot profile is then automatically assigned to a device. Once we get that, then the machine goes into the out of box experience, and then a user then logs in with their credentials, and then once that happens, then the device goes into the autopilot profile deployment phase, where we go into the actual domain join part, and then we go into the part of the applications and configuration, and then we go into the user enrollment part right at the end, and then that device is essentially then ready to go. And then white glove, on the other hand, can follow a very similar pattern. However, in this case, once the actual autopilot white glove profile is deployed, then that machine is then essentially ready to be sealed, and then that device can then be provided to that user as ready to go right off. And that's pretty much how we would see sort of a summary of how we would actually go through on the white glove side. Now, the effects on decision making with pre-provisioning. So here I've sort of created a pie chart to sort of give a full rounded idea on all the areas that would actually affect our decision making when it comes to this. So if we look at the user experience, so we sort of look at the time of readiness. So in the perspective of someone who's actually asking for these requirements for how a user would be onboarded, we want to see how long it would take for that user to hit the ground running. So how long would the actual deployment actually take once a device is then provided to that user, and what is the ease of the actual device setup? So how easy and understandable is it for someone to understand how to actually get onboarded? And then we've got the next side, which is the administrative effort cut down. So how long it takes then to actually build the device. So this is kind of more on a technical user perspective. And then we also look at the quantity ready for distribution. So if we wanted to have spare devices available, which were essentially ready to go, which we didn't have to actually sort of provide to a user so that they go through the normal autopilot white glove process, then we can do that. Then the differences between both methods. So then this is more analyzing the pros and cons between both methods, so that we actually know which method is more perfect fitting for our requirements for that particular client, and which one is more feasible over another. And then the last part is then the purpose and fit into the workflow. So how well does this actually fit into the business model? Does it actually answer everything that they need on their business requirements to then translate into technical requirements? and the impacts on the productivity, and to also make a smooth transition for a BAU perspective and case. Next, the autopilot profile purpose. So here are some scenarios here in which the autopilot and the white glove version of autopilot can actually compare in terms of the comparison. So these scenarios are some of the most common types that I've seen, and maybe some of the most common types in which others have seen as well. So the first scenario is the very straightforward, typical one. We add devices into Azure AD and the autopilot, and then that device is then distributed to the user who will use it, and then they will essentially sign in, and then they will be ready to go. And that would be sort of a very typical normal autopilot profile. Then we've got the second scenario, which is where we have device readiness, which can apply to pretty much any user. So this one is quite interesting because you can actually balance this with a normal autopilot profile as well, but instead you may probably use something like the self-deploying method, which is not necessarily often used, but it is a method which only applies to the standard autopilot configuration, where you can't really use this with hybrid. So it's really specific to the autopilot side. And here you can actually sort of have the device where it applies to any user. And then the same with white glove as well. When you actually deploy that method, that can also go to any user as well. So it doesn't require an actual user to sign on that side. Then we've got the third scenario, which is the device readiness based on group and department. So this one is probably a slightly bit more of a complicated scenario, because this would involve multiple profiles. So you could essentially have an autopilot profile to fill one requirement, and then have white glove essentially fill another. And that's where things can actually get tricky. But sometimes if you want to sort of split out how you want these methods to go, and also to have a good comparison on which route to go, then definitely scenario 3 could be a good fit, but it's not without its complications there. And then scenario 4 is then the hybrid enrollment side, and the hybrid, which we will have a separate section for, has many moving parts to this. And because of the complications with hybrid, sometimes it's very difficult to see how something like white glove, which also has some moving parts to it as well, would fit into this scenario. So when we think of joining a machine to the on-premise and also to the Azure AD as well, we can already foresee a lot of complications and where this would go. So we can see essentially where a white glove method could actually help in this case, rather than subject a user to where some complications can actually go wrong. But there are some more moving parts to this, which we will discuss a little bit further in this presentation. So next, the separation from a cloud version of a task sequence. So this section I felt was actually quite important, because I think when we actually look at the transition from a traditional method of building devices through SCCM via a task sequence, whether it be a sort of a thin task sequence and a thick task sequence, so, or a hybrid one. So thin being practically just a very simple OS build, a thick one being every single application that you could think of, and also configuration as well. And then we've also got a hybrid one where it would detect certain rules and conditions it would have to meet for it to get the configurations that it requires. So when we actually go into designing our actual autopilot strategy, we want to actually take into consideration that we don't want to necessarily replicate the same kind of strategies in SCCM. So what the aim is really is to not turn Intune into SCCM. And this is where this section sort of outlines how we would typically look at things here. So if we look at the SCCM task sequence, so just for example, you'd have sort of three groups of applications. So you'd have one section that would have company standard applications, so maybe typical things like Microsoft Office, Teams being an example, and then application group 2 would be something perhaps more role specific. So something that might be more specific to the particular group that that user or device is a part of, or the particular job or role function in the organization as well. And then application group 3 is then essentially applications which we would consider optional, might not necessarily have that much of a priority, but then it's still just a nice to have just in case, just to sort of predict in sort of which type of user that might actually get that particular device. So what we want to do is essentially convert that and then cut that down into more of a lean deployment process, being the autopilot profile and then the enrollment status page. So the first section, how we want to look here is we want to actually have a priorities here where we can actually section this off a little bit better. So if we look at the autopilot application, so these are the applications that we would see get deployed at the enrollment status page level. And this means that these would be the applications in which would have to be on the device, ready to go before a device could actually be able to go onto the network and then be considered an enrolled Intune device. Then we've got the required applications. So the required applications would be the applications that that particular device or user needs. However, in this case, this wouldn't take place during the autopilot and the enrollment status page part. So this means that the device would actually be ready a lot quicker, as opposed to something like in SCCM where you were to deploy a task sequence to a machine and you would have to wait until literally that whole task sequence was actually finished. So that would be sort of another section of a priority where we get the apps that we need, the configuration that we need, but it doesn't actually hold up the process or the user's time to actually hit the ground running. Then we've got the available applications, and then this is the part where we would make them available via the company portal. Company portal, very similar to how you would see the software center as well. So these are essentially applications which a user can use to get through to the company portal and then have a selection of their own applications in which they feel that they actually need, which are optional and also can contribute to how they work going forward as well. So that's essentially the transition that we want to make. We want to sort of migrate sort of how our configurations may have been when it was in an SCCM environment, but we want to sort of shape them up so that we have a good structure and that we don't bloat and over pollute our workflow going forward when it comes to the autopilot side of things. So that's the more of the importance of this particular slide. So this is a great sort of prerequisite before we actually go further into anything else. Next is the technical user experience. So this is sort of the preparation for devices. So before even getting to the part of deploying anything on the autopilot side, what we've got to take in consideration is then the areas in which we can't actually involve in the autopilot side. And what I mean by that is there's normally a list of, let's say, hardware prerequisite checks that would be checked before you'd actually put a device into autopilot, or even just to be built in general. So with that part, it would be something like the BIOS configurations. So things you consider like, I guess, things like a BIOS administrator password. You've got areas like the areas like TPM, for example, maybe enabling things like virtualization and all different kinds of areas in the BIOS as well. So these areas are most likely gonna have to have someone actually check these particular settings. And if they've already got a build checklist, then they can essentially apply that through and apply them to these devices before we actually get them into autopilot. But having said that, depending on the type of manufacturer that you would have, there are some ways around this. So for example, with Microsoft Surface devices, for example, you have the configuration profiles where you can actually configure all of the BIOS settings there, so that you don't actually have to go through you don't have to necessarily go through doing these manually. And then you could essentially apply this through a configuration profile. So once a device is then added into autopilot, you can then just have everything already configured. So that would be a DFCI profile, which would be, let me see if I can get this right. It's a device firmware configuration interface. And that would be applicable for something like that. Then the next part is the naming convention. So when we think of the naming convention, now for autopilot devices, we can have a naming template for an autopilot device. So we do have some limitations where we have to sort of act within the means, where we can use things like the serial number, or we can use a random generated characters as well. So we've got that part as well. But then we have to consider how this would work in a white glove perspective, because in white glove, yes, we have something which is the main join profile, which allows us to apply a prefix up to 15 characters, which essentially is the max amount for sort of a net bias name. But then what we have to consider is then, well, what if we want to replicate the same kind of naming convention that we would get in a simple autopilot profile? How would we get around that? So those are also the other areas to consider as well. And some of the parts of the naming convention workarounds would be something like to have maybe like a PowerShell script package or a application which can be deployed during autopilot, which would actually have these configurations within them already. There's even other methods of even using the asset tag within the BIOS as well. There are certain tools that you can have where you can actually set the asset tag directly on a machine from using methods such as WMI and PowerShell, which we can touch on a little bit more in further slides. And then we've got the uploading of devices to autopilot. So some of us are familiar with just things like running the commands such as the get Windows Autopilot info PowerShell, where we would generate the hardware hash ID and then manually add that into autopilot as well. But then we've also got to think about devices which may already be onboarded in Intune, and then we have to look at how we would get those as autopilot devices. So there is the autopilot side where we have a profile and then we convert all of those targeted machines to become autopilot devices as well. And then you've also got the white glove side where we would touch on more things like the Intune connector parts, but we will touch on a little bit more on that when we get into the hybrid sections. So this is just the preparation side for the technical user experience. Now here is how we would sort of structure the user experience for the autopilot profile side. So here is sort of a typical configuration that you would see here. So on the technical user perspective, one of the most important things here is having the configurations on not just the profile, but also the enrollment status page that you can see below in the bottom right-hand corner. So we want to be able to have a conversation with the actual end user in case anything actually were to go wrong. And let's face it, things always do go wrong, especially when you have everything configured right. So we have areas such as allow users to reset the device if an installation error occurs. Now, this one is actually quite important because when you think about how our working environments are these days, especially when it comes to things from remote working, or you're not able to actually get to that particular remote site, then you would need to be able to troubleshoot that device from whichever location you're in, and having the actual user reset the device then just allows you to sort of be in a position where that device can go through the out of box experience again and allow you enough time to have a look in the background to see which kind of errors could be occurring there, because sometimes you can get issues where if it doesn't join the domain correctly or something doesn't get configured correctly, you can end up with a ghosted machine where either the machine loses its trust to the domain, or you might find an issue where the machine is not logged onto the domain at all, and then no one can log in at all, especially if you've got a user account type to be configured as standard right here. So then another one is then the actual logs and diagnostics. So you want a user to be able to actually click the button to actually collect the log. So that way, when you actually go into the Intune portal, you can then see the actual collected logs from that device, and that allows you to just troubleshoot a little bit further. So that's kind of more the technical user experience on this side, having it configured perfectly so that you can interact with the user in case of any issues. Now, when it comes to the white glove side, this is probably more of an area where you might get build engineers or technical users or technical staff to actually perform the actual autopilot profile deployment themselves. So in this case, we have a feature here which is allow users to use the device if installation errors occurs, and this is ticked to yes. And the reason for this is, in our case, we have probably more of an understanding on what we may expect to sort of install or work correctly or actually fail. So with that being said, having an option like this, it just gives the actual technical person a little bit of an understanding to sort of have a look at the device, see what went wrong, and sort of repair that. And then once those sort of parts are actually strengthened and they're more tailored, we can then continue on and then refine these settings so that we don't actually have to have that again. But it's definitely good on the more of a troubleshooting and technical perspective. So just to look at the autopilot profile settings here, we've got the hybrid Azure AD join here. You can see what we touched on earlier. We can't actually have a naming template on that side, so that's where we have to be a little bit more creative when it comes to the actual naming conventions as well. But I would say the more simple that you can have the naming convention, where you can use a domain join profile for the prefixes, then the better it will be for you going forward. So the next part is then the user experience. So this is just a very simple way of just structuring out how the user would actually see it after we've configured everything on the technical user perspective side. So on a normal autopilot side, user would actually get the device, they open it up. As soon as they open it up, they would see then a welcome message that would be custom made from the Intune portal on the tenant side. So they literally just sign in. This can sometimes fluctuate in time, so maybe something like maybe 5 to 10 minutes it can take, depending on the kind of network that you have. And then once that part is done, then the machine will then either essentially reboot or then go right into the autopilot profile, and then you'll start to see all of the different sections then go through on that side. One of the areas which normally takes the longest is more around sort of the device configuration stage, where you'd get things like the security profiles, any configuration profiles, and then also the bulk of it as well, the applications as well. So this is why it's important to try and actually limit how many applications you do want on that device before it actually is considered ready to go and ready to be enrolled into Intune, because we can see the duration here can range from sort of 30 minutes to 60 minutes, and that can be sort of quite a generous time that I've actually put there, because sometimes applications like Microsoft Office can take a little bit longer than expected as well, especially when you consider any kind of applications which you may have created, which might have things like PowerShell script methods. If you've got Win32 apps as well, which are configured quite specific, that might have a dependency as well. So essentially something else would be running before that, and that could also take longer as well. Then once we've gotten past that stage, we then get to the point where the user can log in again into the actual Azure AD, and then you've got the last part, which is then the sort of the user enrollment part, where we go through joining the organization, then prepping the user account, making sure all the network parts are configured on that side. And then once we've gone through that stage, then the machine is then ready to go, and the user can then log in right on from that point. So tallying up together, you could be looking at maybe between maybe an hour and an hour and a half in terms of how long it would take for the user to actually go through this particular stage. Now that time can actually vary as well, because not every Autopilot profile configuration is the same, and not everyone's network is the same as well. So those are things are sort of things to consider. But this is kind of maybe a sort of a base average that I've personally seen. Then the next part is then the white glove Autopilot profile. I promise this is not done in a biased way, but this is kind of more the reality on how you would see it sort of on the surface. So at this point, a device is really just provided to a user at this point, where everything is already configured, applications is already there. So at this point, the device would then be configured on the on-premise domain and also on the Azure domain as well. So the device is essentially ready to hit the ground running at this particular point. Some other strategies which are used to sort of prep a device for a user to actually go right into it is sometimes to sort of pre-cache the actual login, where the actual user's login details are logged in before, so that by the time they actually go in to the actual machine, if there are issues on contacting anything on the network, then the actual login and profile is already pre-cached and they're already ready to go on that side. So that covers the technical user perspective, and then the user experience, which is probably more of the key part, especially when you consider how the business requirements then turn into technical requirements. So next, the external perspectives. Now, this is where things get very interesting. So we have to look at the hybrid environments now, and there are many, many moving parts. And when you actually consider these moving parts, it then leaves you to really think about in which method that you actually go. So in a hybrid environment, let's look at some of the moving parts that we've got here. So we've got the Intune connector then, which then syncs the actual those Autopilot devices into your AD. So then that way, once the actual syncs are done, then the machines are essentially then ready for then a hybrid join. So then there's that part you actually have to consider, especially going forward when it comes to the decisions of which method you use on the Autopilot side of things. Then you've got the custom naming convention. So then we discussed that in terms of something outside the domain join profiles and having something a little bit more creative when it comes to your naming convention. So I'll say a good example would be, let's say we have a prefix of, let's say, 3 or 4 characters and then a hyphen, and then we have something like a serial number, like let's say the first 4 parts of a serial number. So if we wanted to configure something like that, then we would probably have to configure something like a Win32 application that had that actual logic and then provide it in there. And because of certain parts and areas in where the actual renaming device can be, this can be tricky because you don't actually know as to whether the device is actually on a domain or on a network at that point or not. So you have to consider whether an account with domain privileges to actually join the machine to the domain would work on this part, or if it would actually be your local account that would work on this. So that's another part to then consider when it comes to configuring the hybrid autopilot profile strategy. Then again, the domain join profile. So then you've got to consider the OU placement in where the device would actually go as well. And then probably the more interesting part is then the actual VPN side, the always on VPN side. So you got to consider how, if you're going to have a configuration profile that would do this, or if you have an actual software client that would actually perform this part, or if it would maybe be something like group policy. Now, this part is interesting because when you consider a lot of organizations that have devices distributed to users either on remote sites or working from home, you've then got the consideration of how is it going to actually perform a hybrid join at that point. So having the always on configuration part is a very sensitive area, and this is probably adds more complications to a hybrid environment too. So you have to then consider if you're going to actually have a user then perform this part where the actual VPN part is connected and then the user can sign into that device, or would you actually have it where the device is already ready to go and it's already on both domains already, and then you already have a VPN profile already on that machine as well, so they don't have to worry about the initial setup. So those are a lot of moving parts there to consider when it comes to choosing the autopilot method. And the next part of it is then the third party. So then these are some of the third party vendors that offer services around the autopilot as well. So again, things like the VPN connection, this is something that quite important that a third-party vendor would actually have to consider on that side. Areas around sort of the BIOS configuration. So essentially, a third party could have areas configured such as the BIOS configurations. They could have things like the asset tagging, and then these devices could already be prepped on that level before they're actually provided then to you or the end user or to the actual or to the organization itself. So those devices are then already prepped on a BIOS configuration perspective, and then they are also in the autopilot profile ready to go as well, or unless they're already pre-built on then sort of a white glove perspective as well. But those types of services are available from sort of multiple third parties. So Lenovo is one that I've actually used probably the most alongside Microsoft and some areas of Dell as well. And the BIOS configuration part can really, really save a lot of time in terms of the device preparation and how much administrative effort gets taken away from the organization itself. So to summarize everything, so the whole sort of point and overview of this is really just to looking at the bigger picture of decision making. So taking consideration the whole picture to understand which method supports your requirements the best. And that's essentially the most important thing. There's not necessarily a wrong or right decision, but it just depends on what is the best fitting and achieves everything that you need. So understanding the fit within the business requirements, knowing and understanding the technical user experience and the user experience. So you have to really understand both sides, because I think a lot of us have been in organizations where either we come on as a technical person or a consultant or an architect, we are still having to deal with a help desk or IT support team that will provide us with a device that goes through the same experience as well. And we have to take into consideration how long is perhaps maybe too long. How long is it to a point where it could affect productivity? And then the due diligence of assessing all scenarios. So having an understanding of all different kind of scenarios that would affect us, which we would use to help us in aid of setting up the perfect autopilot workflow. And then simplicity and less complicated really is key here. I mean, there are environments where you can't escape hybrid environments. There are areas where white glove may already be in use, may not necessarily be in use in the right scenarios, but really to have a smooth process, especially where you can troubleshoot and own the process all round, simplicity is really, really key here, and it really helps for a smooth transition no matter which area you go, and it definitely helps with more of the scalability as well, where you can analyze everything going forward. So yeah, that's the end of the presentation on my side. So I want to say thank you to everyone who attended, and also thank you to all of the sponsors. There's a lot of great sessions happening today on the Modern Endpoint Management Summit today as well. So there's even some I'm quite excited to see as well. So yeah, thank you very much for watching. Hope to see if there are perhaps any questions at all.